In today's webinar, I am Modhurima Amin. I'm an assistant professor at Texas Tech and the chair-elect of South Asia section of AAEA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, where we will explore critical issues surrounding seasonal poverty and internal migration, particularly in South Asia. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us today Dr. Mushfiq Mobarak, a distinguished professor of economics at Yale University, where he holds dual appointments in the School of Management and the Department of Economics. He has earned his PhD in economics from University of Maryland and has since become one of the leading scholars in the field of development economics. He is also the founder and the faculty director of Yale RISE, which focuses on designing and scaling policies aimed at effectively alleviating poverty. Today, Dr. Mobarak will be delivering a talk on seasonal poverty and internal migration with a special focus on Bangladesh and Nepal. We are excited to hear his perspective, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mushfiq Mobarak.
Thank you very much, Modhurima, for inviting me. And a lot of my work is in agriculture and related to agriculture. And today we'll talk about agrarian economies. So I'm really excited to connect with all of you. And let's, I'm going to share some slides, of course, but please feel free to, behave like economists. So if you have questions in the middle, just like stop me, right? In fact, I'm probably not going to be able to monitor the chat very well. Like if people want to raise their hand in chat, Modhurima, maybe you can help and do that. Or if you want to unmute and ask a question, that's fine. But I think might all get more out of it if we just have a conversation rather than me lecturing for an hour. So we stop at sort of 15 past the hour, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we have like 1 hour and 10 minutes left. And do you want me to, reserve some time at the end for questions, or how would you like to do?
Sure, we can do that. That would probably be more useful because then, we don't have to interrupt you.
Okay, that's fine. But I don't mind being interrupted. If there are, burning questions, I'm fine with that too.
Okay,
so let me share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to talk about seasonality or seasonal deprivation, but then we'll talk a lot about migration as a solution to seasonal deprivation. And I go by my middle name, Mushfiq. All right. So let me start. So I'm not going to, I don't know how these seminars are done, but I'm not going to give just a single paper, right? So I've prepared some slides where I'll just give you a little bit of a broader overview about why I've been working on this question of seasonal poverty for the last 17, 18 years, right? And I'm still at it. But then we will talk about sort of specific research results from papers. So I'll start with some research from Bangladesh, and then I'll end with some research from Nepal, on related topics. Okay? I'm going to start with just 2 facts about rural versus urban areas within developing countries, right? That motivates a lot, right? So the first fact that comes from macroeconomists, so this paper I really like in the QJ by Doug Gall and David Lagapas Mike Wong, it's an entirely descriptive paper, right? And an entirely descriptive paper that gets published in a top journal of economics. That's unusual. So it's one of my favorite papers. It just, what they do is something really simple. They're macroeconomists, but they take a bunch of micro data, like micro household surveys, across many, many countries. I think they have something around 75 countries in their set, right? And they just describe what wages look like in rural versus urban areas, which is roughly equivalent to a comparison of agriculture versus non-agricultural wages. Okay. And the main fact that they document in that paper is that wages in urban areas tend to be much, much higher than wages in rural areas within the same country. Okay? So what you have in the table that I've posted from their paper, that's the ratio of urban wages to rural wages. So in the average country, the average ratio is 3.5. So that means that there is a 350% premium in wages in cities compared to rural wages. Okay? So now, of course, that's just a raw gap, right? So the first thing you'd want to do is, based on observables in the data sets, you want to adjust for things like inflation or price differences, I should say, sorry, between urban and rural areas. Um, we should also adjust for like observable dimensions of, say, human capital, education, work experience, labor market attachment, number of hours worked, etc. But once you make those adjustments, that 350% comes to 220%, but that's still a pretty large gap, right? So observably equivalent workers in these surveys, when they're in the city, earn more than twice as much as when they're in the rural area. Okay. And then, so this is across the entire sample of 75 countries, which includes both rich and poor countries, right? And then if you look at the poorer countries, the gaps actually get larger. Okay. All right. So this should motivate a lot of questions for economists, right? So the first question is that, oh, this seems like this could be an arbitrage opportunity, right? So why aren't people taking advantage of this? So if there's no mobility restriction within the country, which is true for most countries, China is an exception because of the hukou system, right? And Vietnam has something like that called the hokao system. But mostly speaking, people can move within countries without any visa restrictions, right? So why don't people just move to another place where they'll earn more than twice as much, right? That seems like a bit of a puzzle. Okay? And at the macro scale for people interested in development, this raises other questions like, maybe developing countries are poor because citizens within those countries are inefficiently spatially allocated in the poorer, less productive areas where wages are lower. And maybe we could generate a lot of growth just by reallocating people spatially, right? A lot of macroeconomics, trying to explain cross-country productivity differences is about misallocation of some sort, right? Misallocation of capital or something like that. And this is, there's a possibility here that maybe there's some spatial misallocation. Yeah. All right, so that's fact number one, that we should be, it should make us think, right? Like maybe we're, I'm not giving you any particular interpretation right now, right? But it should make us think about like whether there is anything to take advantage of here for policymakers. Okay? And the second fact I want to point out about wages is that, like, while there's an average gap in wages between urban and rural areas, that was fact number one. The second fact is that certain times of the year that gap gets even larger, right? And this has to do with so basically it's because wages are much more volatile seasonally in rural areas than they are in urban areas. Urban areas, they tend to be flatter. Okay. And this can take extreme forms like seasonal deprivation, hunger, food insecurity during certain months of the year. Okay. So let me here now show you my own data. Like, this is something I've been tracking in Bangladesh since 2007. So we've been doing this research, multiple papers over many, many years, right? So I've picked the data here from 2015, 2016, but like it always looks like this. There's nothing special about that particular year. Okay. And what I'm plotting here is food insecurity, right? So in my surveys, like people who report being food insecure, like not having enough to eat, like they're trying to restrict the number of meals they eat per day. Often they may eat 2 meals a day rather than three, right? Or they restrict portion sizes. And then in Indonesia, I've also collected this kind of data where the coping mechanism seems to be like certain months of the year, you just don't eat protein because it's more expensive, right? You try to survive. Yeah. And I'm just plotting like the proportion of people who report that they are food insecure. Like the bottom one is often or regularly or sometimes. Yeah. And so you see that during certain months, majority of the rural poor, these are basically landless poor in northern Bangladesh, in the Rangpur region. Majority are reporting that they actually have to miss meals or restrict portion size, right? During some days during these months, and then 25% of people are regularly missing meals during that period. Yeah. So it's like a shock that happens every year. So it's an expected shock. So it has a name. We know it as Monga. Comes from an Urdu word mehenga, which means like period of high prices. Okay. So let me explain what's going on here, right? And why we should think a lot more about this. Okay. So what's going on is basically what you guys all do, which is agriculture. Okay. So the main month for planting is July. Okay. That's the almond, when the almond rice is planted. And then you harvest around December, January, right? So see what happens in July and in December. right? That's when you have a lot of work to do, right? So look, just in Bangladesh, just like in the rest of South Asia, most people who are engaged in agriculture are actually landless. They supply their labor on other people's farm, right? So during planting, during harvest, there's work to be had. So people get jobs, and that's why food insecurity is lower, right? There's labor demand, so wages are not so bad. But then this period is basically the pre-harvest period, the pre-harvest lean season. What's going on is that you're basically just waiting for the crop to grow, right? You've planted, you're waiting for the crop to grow. There's some work like weeding, etc., that one can do, but labor demand falls, right? Labor demand and wages fall. And unfortunately, I've shown in papers that it coincides with the period when the price of rice goes up. Okay? So that might have to do with the fact that it's been the longest time. Like here, September, October is the longest time since the last harvest, right? Like it's been 10 months since the last main harvest. So there's like probably some other market failure around storage, et cetera, that's going on, right? But now think about what happens. So the wages are low, prices are high. That means something has to give. And that is caloric intake, which is what this seasonal deprivation or seasonal hunger is, right? So I'm showing you Bangladesh. Later on, I'll show you a graph from Nepal. It looks very similar, right? So Bangladesh, we call it Monga. In Indonesia, in eastern islands of Indonesia, the poorer parts, also collected this type of data. It's called something else, musim paceklik, like the musim, like the Bangla word mushroom means season, like season of hunger. And then Studu in Francophone West Africa, but like in another country where I work, Malawi, Zambia, etc., it's just called the hungry season, right? So people are like expected to go hungry during part of the year. Yeah? All right, so that's the problem, right? That I've been trying to think about, and I started with this. I'm not starting with a specific paper. I'm just starting with descriptive facts for you because I really hope, like my ulterior motive for doing this talk, is that I really hope other young researchers get interested in this because I think this is an important dimension of poverty for us to think about. We don't normally think about poverty as a chronic phenomenon, but there's also this seasonal dimension of poverty that I hope more people think about and work on because I think it's important. Okay. So now what are the implications of this seasonality? Yeah. So one way that policymakers might think about this is that, we need to create job opportunities during lean seasons. There's no work, right? And in fact, the world's largest workfare program, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, right? That is about creating lean season employment, right? But this can also distort labor markets because if you create like guaranteed employment, of course, that's going to affect people's decisions, right? Like, so for example, Clément and Jean Pat show that this precludes people from migrating to better job opportunities, etc. Now, that's one way to think about solving the problem, which is let's try to create job opportunities, right? But another way to think about this problem is that, maybe we don't want to, like, there are some structural reasons why jobs don't exist. Everybody's waiting for the crop to grow, right? So maybe what we want to do is rather than trying to prop up that area, we might want to connect those rural folks who don't have work during that season. Maybe we want to connect them to urban areas where we know from fact number one that wages are much higher, right? And much less volatile. Right? That's a different way to go, right? A macro policymaker might think about either improving connectivity between rural and urban areas or propping up the rural area. Right? So we should be thinking about that or helping them think about it, right? And explicitly, we might even want to think about facilitating migration, right? But then you're getting into research that's much more micro and behavioral in nature, right? I don't mean behavioral economics, but like trying to understand people's behavior as opposed to why is it that people don't migrate, right? So there is a research agenda that has developed about trying to understand why people don't migrate away from these seasonal famine-prone areas into more productive places, right? So why is it that people are remaining in low productivity areas? So and this literature has, I've done a lot of work in this area, and this literature has, and others have too, has come up with many different categories of issues, right? So a simple thing is just migration is costly. Yeah. And all three papers here are former students, Garrett Bryan, Melanie Morton, Sam Bazi, Maria K. Clemens, right? All of the papers are on Indonesia, right? Maybe that's not surprising because, when you have a country with 18,000 islands, right, that's migration is in fact costly there. It's not like hopping islands is not as cheap as moving in some other parts of the world, right? Now, so this could be costly. Another possibility is that migration is risky, right? That, yes, so sure, wages are higher, as we saw, right? But you're not guaranteed that job, right? So maybe you're poor and you go and you try to find work and you fail, right? And that's a risky proposition for people. And in fact, if you go all the way back to Arthur Lewis, when he was trying to teach us about structural transformation, right? The way that he modeled this was like, yeah, wages are higher, but it's more risky in the urban areas. Okay? Another category of reasons why people might not move is that there may be some non-wage characteristic amenity in the village of origin, right, that we really need access to. That's not easy for me to replicate in the urban area. I lose access to that, right? And that's why I don't move. It's not so much about wages, it's about something else about the location. Okay, so my colleagues Kaivan Munshi and Mark Rosenzweig, right, identify using data on caste networks, Jati, Upajati networks in India. They identify informal risk sharing as one such thing, right? Which is that, look, we don't have formal insurance, so we have to rely on each other. So all of us might be a village and we're helping each other out, right? I need to solve that problem, and wages are not enough. I also need insurance, right? Now, my insurance is my network at home. And if I move to the city, I lose that. And if I cannot easily build another network in the city, that might prevent me from migrating, even though wages are high, right? So that could be a reason. So another reason is, like NREGA-like programs, right? Or microcredit programs in Bangladesh, etc., right? These might actually distort people's decision away from engaging in profitable migration. So people stay back in the rural area because they want to take advantage of the stuff that's being given out there. Right? So that could be a distortion. Now, the other thing that I'll talk a little bit about today is that there's also non-monetary cost of migration. So often migration is not whole household because it's like circular temporary migration, right? It doesn't make sense for you to take your whole family and kids because cost of living in the city is very high. Yeah. So then it might come with family separation, right? You might also have to live in an urban slum and the living conditions aren't great, right? So there might also be some non-monetary disutility associated with migration, and we need to understand that. Okay. Oh yeah, this paper actually already came out last year, but not forthcoming anymore. And then another category of reasons is that, just like I was saying, that there's something about the rural area that we cannot replicate. There might be some other non-wage attribute of the urban area that we dislike. Right? So in this particular paper, we look at how pollution variation across cities in China mediate people's migration decisions, right? So it turns out people dislike pollution, they're staying away from it, they're migrating away from those areas. And the other thing we find in that paper is that skilled versus unskilled people are differentially responsive. Educated, uneducated people are differentially responsive, right? And that has productivity consequences too, if all the skilled people are leaving certain types of places. Okay? So that was a very quick overview of a large literature on what prevents migration or what are the sort of correlates of migration. And a lot of this, some of what I do here is based on experiments. Other people are using, they're trying to use good empirical techniques to even not, if not experiments, some good some good empirical techniques in order to identify sort of causal effects of these factors on migration. Okay. So I'll start by telling you how I got into this back in 2007. Okay. So basically I grew up in Bangladesh. Just before you all joined, I was talking to Modhurima about going to Bangla medium school in Dhaka. And so this is I probably grew up earlier than she did. Much earlier, maybe. So this is an issue, like the manga issue I was talking about. This was written about in newspapers almost every year. Some years it was much worse than others. So we knew about this problem. The government knows about this problem. Bangladesh's NGOs know about this problem. that there is seasonal deprivation during certain months, right? And they were doing something about it. So the government would do like food for work programs, just like NREGA, just smaller scale, you know. Then Bangladesh has like a very well saturated NGO sector. They do like targeted microcredit during that period, right? So, but then all of those strategies was about like helping people in these rural areas, right? So that's when I was young and back then. Like my idea, I wanted to try out something different, which is like, okay, the government's doing all of this in you know, for propping up rural areas. Let me see if like a complementary strategy might be to take people away from those rural areas and put them in the urban areas where we know that job opportunities exist. Right? That was my idea. Right. So let's try that out. Right. And Shamal Chaudhary, who's at University of Sydney, was my collaborator on this. Yeah. And so basically that was and we ran it as an experiment, with a randomized control trial. We went to rural households, right, and offered them transport subsidies, okay, which equivalent like about 800 taka, equivalent to about $11.50 back then. And the idea was, why this amount? It was because that would pay for the round trip bus fare plus a few days of food for the types of destinations that people from that area, when they migrate, they like to go to, right? So if you happen to know Bangladesh, it's like, you know, we're doing this in Lalmorinhat and Kurigram, which is in North Bengal, the north of the country, and the poorest part of the country by many measures. And you know, the types of places where people like to travel are like Dhaka is the single most common destination, but also Bogura, Tangail, Munshiganj, these are other places that people like to go. Yeah. So imagine like these are places that are like a day's travel away, right? So it's not easy for you to, it's not a commuting distance, like you really have to migrate, but it's also temporary seasonal migration. So remember my food insecurity graph, right? So September, October, November is the period that you want to be away when there's not much to do in the village and you want to be in the city, right? And my idea was, okay, let's say I'll just pay for that. I'm just going and telling people that I'm paying for the round trip bus fare plus a few days of food. So I'm basically insuring the trip to try it out. The only condition for taking the money is that somebody from the household should try this out. Yeah. And if it doesn't work out, you can come back. Like I'm not forcing you to stay for very long, right? Like, no, I'm not telling you how many days you should stay, who within the household should go, right? Where you should go. I'm not saying any of that. Just try this out, and I mean, I'm going to insure the trip. Yeah. But the idea is that hopefully they go to the city, they find work often in construction sectors, right? Or rickshaw pulling, right? Dhaka, that's a very um, common occupation. Or they might go to other places, peri-urban, rural places where they might be doing potato farming, which has a different calendar, right? So there's work you could find like that. And then hopefully you find this work and then you either send money back home or bring money back home. Yeah. So that was the idea. But we did it as a trial to see if this actually works, right? So then some villages randomly chosen received the incentive and others didn't. Okay. And okay, so now let me go back to the seasonality issue. Why are we doing this in Bangladesh, right? Like I showed you this graph, right? It's just that this is not a new problem at all. Like I didn't invent this problem. I wasn't not nearly the first person to notice it, right? This is a paper published in 1884 in the journal Nature, where they identified seasonality and mortality. Yeah? And you know, why is that? Because you know the British, for tax purposes, they kept good records, and that's why we had these records to be able to publish papers. Yeah? So that's from a century ago, right? And then Bangladesh has a nice demographic surveillance site in Matlab, where we see seasonal patterns. This is in the 1970s, right? The same sample has been followed because it's a demographic surveillance site. They're constantly followed. You see seasonality in the 1990s, right? And then in contemporary data, right? I've been looking for how much seasonality there is. This is not an easy problem to solve because to understand seasonality, you need to collect data over the course of the year, right? And that's not how we normally collect data. Normally, we go do a survey once a year or something like that. But the way I do this indirectly is that in like LSMS surveys or DHS surveys, right, which are large scale surveys that on living standards or on health, right? Now they're large enough that the survey actually, the sample is so large that it takes the whole year, right? So then what happens is that some people, if you look at the interview dates, you'll see that some people are surveyed in January, some in March, some in September, some in November, etc., right? And now there are some questions in there, like in the LSMS survey, there's consumption modules that ask you about what you were eating for the past couple of weeks, right? So then somebody who's surveyed in March, I can get a snapshot of what their consumption is like in February, right? Somebody in September, I can get a snapshot of what consumption is like in August, right? And if you're willing to make an assumption about no sort of strategic survey timing of different types of household, right? Then you can map out what seasonality might look like over the course of the year, right? So you see that, and the DHS, of course, kids are measured. So some kids you're measuring them, their height and weight in March, some you're measuring them in October, yeah? So that's why you get like data on like seasonal variation in meals per day, you get wasting, right? Like weight for height, z-scores, etc. And you see seasonality in contemporary data as well, right? So it makes, other people have written about this too. Like we think that maybe 600 million or more have are suffering from some sort of seasonal deprivation. 600 million people. Okay. And then the other issue I'm just trying to make the case that you all should start thinking about this too. So with climate change, this is a picture from the New York Times where they had an article about this. These problems might actually become even more acute. Right? Okay. So why do we care about seasonal deprivation? Okay. I think there's two categories of reasons we should worry about this. So one is that, first of all, we're talking about a failure of consumption smoothing, right? And we immediately, in your first week of graduate school, you learn that that's problematic, right? I mean, it's problematic directly because if children are not eating properly for 3 months of the year, that's a problem, right? That's going to undermine their cognitive development and their physical development. It will make them less productive later in life. Yeah? That's a problem. That's one reason we should directly care about it. But another reason that's shown up in research is that when people are hungry for parts of the year, right, then that hunger makes them, like chasing that hunger makes them take some desperate actions, which is actually not good for the family, right, and not good for their long-run productivity. So for example, like this is a paper from Zambia that Kelsey Jag, Gunther Fink, and Felix Massier wrote in Zambia. They ran an experiment where during the lean season, they just gave people bags of maize as like a consumption loan, yeah, just to give them something to eat during that period. Yeah? And they find that what happens is that like when people get the consumption loans, they don't become desperate and go work on other people's farms. They actually tend to their own farms, and they show that makes them more productive, like over the course of the season, right? So what's going on is that absent the loan, when they're chasing hunger, what they do is they actually do something that's actually, that makes them poorer, right? It's kind of like a poverty trap. They work on other people's farms and they just like don't maintain their own farms, and then they get lower productivity and they still poor that way. Yeah. And then in Selim Guleshi has a paper in Bangladesh where he shows that during that period, that September, October, November in Bangladesh that I'm talking about. So his data is from the same region. And he shows that like laborers, people without the landless laborers, they go to their employers and say, I know you don't have any work for me right now because it's like we're waiting for the crop to grow, but please give me something to eat. And in exchange, I will work for you for free come harvest time when you need labor. Okay? So it's like basically you're forward selling your labor, right, in order to address your hunger. Okay? And obviously, there's going to be some like implicit interest rate being charged on that exchange on that contract, right? So what he shows is that that rate is very, very high. So people are staying poor because they're basically borrowing at very high interest rates, right? Using their labor as the collateral. Okay? So, and then, you like if you're just chasing hunger, you're just spending everything on consumption. So people who have land which is true. In Bangladesh, this is not the case, but in other countries, right, which are less densely populated, right, including Zambia, including Nepal, we see that people withhold investments, right, that actually reduce their long-run payouts. Right? They don't invest in fertilizer, they just buy food. So those are the two categories of reasons I think it's important. And now when you think about, okay, so this is a failure of consumption smoothing, how do we solve it? There's two categories of ways we can solve it. So one is you can smooth intertemporally, right? Meaning you can use credit markets or savings. Right? You save from the past or you borrow from the future. Right? And of course, there's a large literature in development economics about like market failures in credit and savings, right? But the other way you can do it, which is what I've been talking a lot about, is that rather than smoothing over time in that location, you could just pick that time, the low lean season, and you could smooth spatially, like spatially diversified. This is the idea of like you have to migrate and send remittances back, right? So there are these market frictions in the intertemporal smoothing. There's also some market friction in the spatial smoothing. Like, for example, my colleague Kevin Donovan and Wyatt Brooks, they've written a really nice paper in Econometrica on building bridges in Nicaragua to show that once people have access to bridges that give you consistent connection to local markets, right? People make much better sort of economic decisions. Okay, so let me tell you about, I told you about this experiment here, right? So let me tell you what happened. Yeah, what happened when I gave people bus tickets. So basically, I gave them these bus tickets. So then I had this treatment group that received either, there were actually two different groups. One received a grant of the $11.50. One received a zero interest loan. Okay? And the first thing I see is that you can get people to migrate. Migration rate increased by about 22 percentage points. Okay? So in the control group, about 35.9% of people migrate, right? In the treatment group, it goes up to, like in the cash group, it goes up to like 60. Okay? So and then I had this information group, and the reason is that if I go and give people money to migrate, right, it would be weird for me to show up and say, oh, here's some money for you to migrate, but I can't tell you anything about it. I can't do anything else. That would be a strange interaction, right? So of course I was giving people general information. So nothing specific or not connecting people to any job or anything like that. I was just saying, look, here we did surveys. Like here are the types of places people like to go to, like, the place I told you, Dhaka, Bogora, Tangai, etc. And here are the sectors they work in, and here are the average wages in those sectors during that period. So I gave some general information. No, that could have had an effect. So I then had this separate group of just information only, where I just gave that information without the money, right? So when I give this information, exactly, again, 35.9% of people migrate. And there's absolutely 0.0% effect of just providing information on their migration cases. Okay? Why would that be? Like imagine, so a third of people, control group tells you that a third of people are already doing this, right? This is part of their diversification strategy. Okay? So if you're already doing this, like one of your three neighbors already migrates. Okay? So then you know that it's possible. So Mushfiq coming and saying, well, oh, look, this is possible. Obviously, people's reaction is, yeah, I know it's possible. But there's something preventing me from going. That's not your lack of information. Okay? But money seems to be. Okay? Okay, so the first result is that people go. When you offer them money to go, they go. Okay? The second result, and by the way, if you want to read the detail in the paper, it's Garrett, Bryan, Shamal Chaudhary, and that's the three authors, and it's in Econometrica in 2014. Okay? And the second thing is that now that I get people to go, I have this random variation in migration, right? If you have an instrument for migration, and the instrument is my randomized treatment. Okay? So I can use that to study the effect of migration because I have random variation. Yeah. And the bottom line result I'll tell you is that if you are induced to migrate by this program, so a late estimate, your family remaining behind at home. So I spent most of my effort collecting data on family members, who's typically the male household head who migrates, in most cases. So the family members, wife and children remaining behind, and I collected very detailed data on them. And we find that your family members end up consuming 600 calories per person per day more if you migrate, or if you are, yeah, if you're induced to migrate by yeah, by the credit or the grant.
Sorry,
So
I have a question, if you don't mind. So the 600 calories per person per day, did you collect information on food consumption by each individual household member separately, or are you like sort of, did you collect this information at the household level but are now dividing it equally amongst household members to get the
exactly, it's a household level data, not individual level data.
sounds good.
On food, that's a numerator, right? And then the denominator is the number of people who are eating out of that, right? So because the reason for doing it this way is that our consumption surveys are on the basis of what they were, their shopping, right? So what they were spending money on. Like for
Right.
some items which are frequently bought, like we asked about this week, right? Some items which are less infrequently bought, we asked about the last month, right?
I see.
So
Okay.
there's no way to get like, how much of that rice am I eating, right?
Right.
It's more like here's a list of 9 types of dal and how much you spend on any of it in the last month.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying.
So this is basically the total amount of expenditures, like converted into calories, divided by number of people and it's eating out of it. Okay, so now that's result number 2. Result number 1, you can get people to go. Number 2, if they go, their family ends up consuming more. And by the way, this is not making anybody rich, okay? This intervention, it's basically moving you from 2 meals a day to 3 meals a day. Right? So, and we observe, actually, I get zero effect on savings. Right? Every extra bit that people get, money that people get, they just eat. Okay? As they probably should if people are hungry. And the third result, which was quite surprising, is that a year later and 3 years later, remember circular migration during this longer season, the pre-harvest lean season, right? So I went back during that same season, a year later, 2 years later, to ask questions. I didn't repeat the program, right? And I left a sample that we were looking at the long run effect. And what you see is that people choose to remigrate a year later and 3 years. Yeah? Now, it's not at 60%, right? You see that about half the people we induced, right? They chose to go back. Yeah? And then, of course, I dug deeper into this, right? And then when you ask people here, like 3 years later, okay, what were you doing this year? Right? A lot of the people who remigrated, they say that we went back and worked for the same employer that we had met back in 2008 in the experiment. Okay? So they grow in long-term asset here, which affects longer-term decision. It's not money, it's not savings. Like I said, there's no savings there, right? It's not like I have extra money now that I use to buy the bus ticket for myself. What they instead do is that their asset that they grow is a connection to an employer. Like an employer saying, oh, look, you've proven yourself to be a reliable worker. Come back next year, you can have the same job. Okay? And that's what's driving the remigration. Okay. So those are the 3 results. So essentially what I then do is I'm gonna skip over this a little bit, the theory, so if you read the paper, the first section is what I just described. There's 4 sections to the paper. The first section is like the experimental results. The second section is a model that tries to make sense of the experimental results. Like what behavioral, I shouldn't use the word behavioral since it means something else in our literature these days. So what characteristics of individuals do I need to have such that this type of result would be observed, right? So it turns out we have a model that has risk aversion, so people who are close to a subsistence constraint, right? And going below subsistence is very, very risky, right? And there's some individual specific uncertainty, which is that, like, I don't know how well my skills will fare in the destination. I can't just know that by observing my neighborhood. Yeah. So if there's some risk like that, then you'll have the poor household that find it too risky to migrate. That's why they don't do it. But on average, it works out when they do migrate, right? As long as the downside risk is covered, which is what my experiment is doing, but they don't have a way to cover that risk themselves. Okay. Now, where we fall short in that paper is that then we go back and test the model, and we do find a lot of evidence in favor of these elements. Okay? But like quantitatively, it just still didn't seem like a fully satisfying explanation because you would need people to be very, very risk averse to be able to make sense of all the data, right? So the new paper that came out again in Econometrica last year with David Lagakos and Mike Work, we tried to do a better job. Like we have to add other things to the model. I'll come back and talk to you about it to make a better sort of quantitative accounting of all the data. And the thing that matters is, thinking carefully about the unmeasured disutility of migration. Remember in giving you the story, right? I was like really focused on the economic benefits of migration, but it turns out that's not the only thing that people care about. And it's not just about wages, but other things like family separation or living conditions and so on. All right. So anyway, so basically, based on all of the data work that I showed you, I was saying at least 600 million people are facing this kind of seasonal deprivation of hunger. Okay? And so maybe migration is a solution for a lot of these people. Maybe we'd be able to get much better outcome than just seasonal hunger, accounting for the fact that, oh, look, a lot of the people who are going seasonally hungry, they're about, 3-4 hours, within 3-4 hours of a city where there are jobs available during those periods. It's not true for every country, but many of those people, they might be able to do better. Okay? So this is the question that was posed to me by funders, right? Like effective altruist types, or if I would say EA adjacent people, right? Which is like, okay, look, these results look promising. Why don't we think about like turning this into a program? Okay. So that's when now I want to talk a little bit about scaling complexities, which Modhurima briefly mentioned in the way she did my introduction, right? Which is that now, you have, so the question that was posed to me is, look, you have this experiment that shows that you can get people to go, they do better, and then they choose to go back again, right? So why don't we think about scaling this up? So my reaction to that was, and this was kind of like my thought process from that phone call, it was ultimately led to the creation of YRISE, the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation at Scale, is that my reaction was like, look, I showed you these results with 2,000 people, 2,000 families. Now, I stand by those results. The trial was well done. But then if you start inducing 20,000 people or 200,000 people to move, it may not look the same, right? Not because the trial was wrong, just because like once you start scaling up, a lot of other things start changing. Right? So then we thought systematically about what those other things might be. And I was like, look, I would only feel comfortable recommending this as a program if we get rigorous information about those scaling complexities, right? So now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about all of the different uncertainties that come up. And then the reason I've been at it for the last 15 years is that I've continued doing research on all these complexities and uncertainties. Okay? So the first is, note that the first paper that I wrote, right, really was just about the top left corner, which is the direct economic effects on beneficiaries, right? But if you move from 2,000 to like 20,000, we actually moved to 35,000 next, yeah? Then there's, that may still be a drop in the bucket in these very massive Bangladeshi megacities, right? But it still could represent a large share of villagers from a particular place, and that might affect the village. Okay? So in what ways would it affect the village economy? It could like change prices, it could change wages if a lot of people leave, right? And then it starts affecting other people. So what we call general impediment. So that's one dimension of concern, that as you keep scaling up, there's going to be all these spillover effects, general spillover effects on other people who we are not directly working with. Right? Because the people who we induce to migrate, they're connected with others in the labor market, in risk sharing, right? In terms of food prices, all sorts. Right? And then the second category of things is that it's not just about economics. We already talked about, that it's not just income and consumption. It's also about family separation, right? It's also about other unintended consequences like like, you know, typically it's males that migrate, but that's the nature of the jobs that are available. Okay? But if I'm creating new economic opportunities for men, that might have inadvertent consequences on the rest of the family, right? Like it could lead to, if men are leaving, it could lead to divorce if the man finds, like in Indonesia, that was a big concern every time I talk to policymakers, right? Like what if he starts another family? Yeah? Or he could bring back diseases, right? It could lead to divorce. It could lead to changes in outcome for children, right? Which could be either positive or negative. Who knows? But the point is that if you want to scale up, you really do need to think through these types of uh, indirect effects, right? So that's one area we're doing research in. And then what are the spillover effects, right? You might want to think about, look, if migrants, you know, you create opportunities for some people and they move out, right? Maybe that'll improve rural wages during the lean season because a lot of the people are leaving, so wages don't fall as much. It's a labor supply shock. On the other hand, if more skilled people are leaving, and if you think that there's some skilled labor, unskilled labor complementarity in the production function, then you might make the unskilled workers worse off. Right? So we'd have to think through that. Now, what about the price of food? So imagine that food markets are not well integrated. Okay. So then, you know, you create this migration opportunity, they bring back more money, but there's no more food. So it's just going to cause inflation. The migrant family, they're fine, but the non-migrant family, they're going to be worse off. It's just creating a transfer from the non-migrants to the migrants. Okay. And then, you know, if wages do indeed go up, right, somebody has to pay for it, and that would affect the employer, the landowners, right? So we might not worry too much about it, but on the other hand, these landowners are politically powerful, so that could also create political complexities. Right? So it is a really complex problem. Okay, risk sharing. So, you know, we are all part of a network. We're helping each other out. Suddenly I find this new opportunity and I'm better off in autarky. I have a better outside option now. Then I might be less interested in sharing risk with you, right? Now I'm doing better on my own. And then so other non-migrants might actually be worse off. Okay? And then finally, you might have to go to like when you move from 20,000 to 200,000, we might need to worry about like the spillovers in the city as well, and about lots of in-migrants coming in. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of a hint as to how we might answer these questions, right? So that's what we ended up doing next. We reran the experiment, but now it had a more complicated design. So remember, my first experiment was I had just had a treatment control. Some people received migration offers, which is blue people, and some people did not, which is green people. Okay. But now I complicated the experiment by saying, okay, I'm going to do that again, but now I'm also going to have village level variation. Okay. So I'm going to go to some villages where I'll treat with high intensity or high saturation, where I'll go and make offers to like 70% of the people. Okay. And then in other villages, I'll go and make offers to only about 14% of the people. Okay. So then what happens is that now you're creating a situation, right, where like in my village, right, Modhurima, Aditya, everybody gets offers, right? There's lots of blue people, okay? Let's say Jessica does not. But in this village, like Fatima gets an offer, but Ashok does not, okay? So now what's going on is that over here, like Modhurima gets an offer, and over here, Fatima gets an offer. They both get the same offer, right? Okay? But they may react differently to it because the random variation is that Modhurima gets the offer along with many of her friends. Fatima gets an offer when her friends don't, right? And similarly, we might have a situation, maybe Aditya gets unlucky and doesn't get an offer here. Ashok gets unlucky, doesn't get an offer here, right? But the difference is that Aditya has lots of friends who are getting offers at the same time, right? So then I observe, for example, that Aditya is actually more likely to migrate than the control group and these guys and Ashok, because even though he's not receiving an offer, many of his friends are going, so he goes, right? It's less risky that way, I guess. Right? And I also see that Modhurima is much more reactive to the offer than Fatima is. right? Why? Because she can travel with others, right? It's less risky to go, right? And then I observe that what happens, like the general equivalent effect I see, the most of the effect comes from the fact that Aditya here, right? Even though I never talked to him, I see an increase in his income, right? And the increase in his income is primarily coming from the fact that he migrated, right? Just because his friends were going. Okay? And you can also imagine that using this design, I can also track food prices, right? So I have a big, so now that I see that Modhurima, Aditya are very likely to go, right? There's a big labor supply shock here, and there's a small one here, right? So then I see, I can look at the study, the effect of a lot of people leaving relative to few people leaving. Yeah. And so, for example, I observed like you can study food prices that way. So what happens to food prices in this village compared to this village, right? So in this village, I see that food prices indeed go up, but only not for rice, which is pretty well well integrated market, but fish prices go up here compared to there. Why is that? Because fish, because of refrigeration, etc., it's less tradable, right? Okay. But then to understand that inflationary effect, I have to understand how big of the consumption basket is fish relative to rice. It turns out for most things, like rice takes up 70% of people's baskets, right? And the price difference there is zero. Okay, okay, so that's how we can answer
I
this
have
question.
a clarifying question, Mushfiq.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please go back to your previous slide. So in the low and high intensity villages, are these the villages that were previously treated or
No,
and the
it's not.
control? It's
Oh,
a
good.
completely new set of.
Oh, yeah, right. No, actually, yeah. So we had overlapping. So we ran the experiment both in these villages, but also in new sort of villages, both in the villages that were treated back in 2008, like 6 years prior. So this new experiment was 6 years later, right? And we have both types.
And the control villages would be ones that were never exposed to the treatment before.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
And one follow-up, just on the idea that you were talking about spillovers. So in the villages, in the high intensity villages, you'd have people who might get uh, better job opportunities because more people are migrating out, so they might see higher wages as you were explaining. But there could be another effect that more people are migrating out, they're sending remittances back to the villages, and there might be higher income spillovers. So how are you going to tease out the income spillovers versus?
Oh, I actually, very good question. We do that, right? So essentially what we find is that wage data I can collect from the employers, right? Without even talking to you guys, I do find that in fact wages do go up. Or another way to say it is that during the lean season, wages don't fall as much in this village compared to this village because in relative terms, there's a labor shortage here, right? Because a lot of people have left. Okay. So I see wages going up. And then in terms of labor supply, right, I can look at separately for the migrant as well as non-migrant household members, right? So for example, what happens to women labor supply? Okay. You see, yeah, I mean, you have a good theory there, Oliver, but it's not true. Like there's no effect on labor supply of anyone other than the main sort of household head, like who's the migrant, right? So major labor supply effect that I see is that when the person who migrates, they work many more hours. And just because like unemployment is a problem in the rural area during that season and less so in the urban area.
Thank you.
Yeah. So overall, like income goes up because the migrant income is going up. And there's no mitigating effect of labor supply falling as like others. Yeah. All right. Okay, so now let's talk about things that are, so I kind of give you the design that answers a lot of these questions, right? But let's talk about some things that are more complicated, like risk sharing. Again, I mean, this is a paper that happens to have 4 authors, all with the last name M. So think about the complication here, okay? So if we're all part of a risk sharing network, right? And then some people migrate, right? How would it affect the people who are remaining behind, right? So on the one hand, like as I said, one problem is that, okay, I get an offer. So now I have an opportunity to work elsewhere, and I have that earning opportunity. So I've gotten some other kind of insurance, basically urban insurance, essentially, right? So I might be less interested in sharing risk with you, right? And to keep me interested, like in equilibrium, you might have to allow me to keep more of my income, right? For me to remain in the network, right? There's like a participation constraint for me that's more binding now, right? Okay. Another thing that, like Cynthia Kinnan, her job market paper, which I think is in the Journal of Human Resources, has a nice model of this. She also points out other reasons why risk sharing is imperfect is that like basically hidden income is an issue, right? I like to, one reason is that I'm going to try to hide my income so I don't have to share it with you. Now, if I induce people to migrate, they might have an easier time hiding their income from others, right? Or similarly, moral hazard, right? If I'm having to share with you, then I'm going to undersupply effort, right? And if I make it more difficult for you to monitor my effort because I'm now somewhere else, you can't monitor me easily, then that might undermine the sharing, right? So those are all like negative effects. On the other hand, the positive effect here is that like I've migrated. So if I'm remaining part of the network, now as the network as a whole, we have diversified a bit more spatially, right? And so we might be able to share risks better. So essentially we have a model, and then it's even more complicated because the nature of risk sharing might actually allow you to migrate or not, right? So it's endogenous in the other direction as well. Anyway, we have a structural model of that and use the experiment to test it. And basically what we find is that there's a 40% improvement in risk sharing. Right? So the indirect effect actually positive, both here it's positive, the indirect spillover effects. Here is positive, right, for other workers. But of course, employers have to pay for those, right? Now, and then migration decisionality. How do you, let me give you a hint about that, what the new econometrical paper does. Now, of course, that's not directly observable, right? It's also not measurable, right? So it's not like I can go and like run some new surveys where I go and ask people, oh, tell me how much you miss your kids. Yeah, and now tell me the dollar value of how much you miss your kids. I mean, obviously that would be a ridiculous way to do the research, right? So instead, what we end up doing is, like, remember I showed you that lots of people remigrate, like about 50% of people choose to go back again. But then if I look at the first year's performance, I see actually 80% of people are successful, right? So then what that's telling me is that there's a lot of people who are successful who choose not to remigrate. Right? And so those two facts together tell me something about what their unobserved decisionality must have been, such that even though I measure them as economically successful, they're like, no, this is not for me. Right? And so we have basically a dynamic macro model where we use moments like that to discipline the model. That's how we indirectly get a sense of like how much decisionality there must have been. Right? So essentially what I'm trying to tell you here, without going into any one paper, is that there are many papers here. Some of them are empirical, some of them have to be structural, some of them have to be more macro, right? And even though we have experiments to answer all of the relevant questions here, we do need to, sorry, I keep jumping. To answer all the relevant questions here, we do need a range of different methodologies, right? Both like structural labor type, macro type, modeling type, as well as randomized control trials. Okay. So essentially, like basically, this is my migration story, right? And I kind of, felt like, look, I'm trying to be responsible here. I don't want to scale up a program, right? And take millions of dollars of people and then start doing it if I don't understand what all those indirect effects are, right? Because this is not just like giving somebody a deworming pill, right? This is like inducing people to migrate is a much more invasive type of intervention in people's lives, right? We need to understand this better. That's why I've been at it for so long. Right? So, but that made me think that, look, if we are going to scale up, right, something that bothered me is that we often, in the last 25 years, I guess, when all of you have been in the profession, I'm assuming, right? Like we've moved in development economics, we've moved heavily towards like rigorous evaluation, right? Which is great. And a Nobel Prize was given for that, which is great, right? But then the thing that bothers me is that we kind of insist on rigorous evaluations for the first like pilot scale trial, like I did in 2000 with 2,000 people. And then once we see like some promising result here, we're like, okay, now we have to scale up, right? And we'll just scale and we'll do this 100 times over, right? What's the effect at scale? People's answer is typically the lazy one, which is, oh, remember that trial we did? Multiply that 100 times, that's what our effect is. But all of us know that's not right, right? And if we really care about improving people's lives, which is why we should all be in this business, right? Then you really do want to keep asking yourself questions, right? And not like declare victory too early based on one trial, right? And I'm not saying you should stop doing anything in the world because you need to do more and more research. Well, the approach we took here is, no, it's not like we stopped. What we did was we did move from 2,000 to 35,000. We did move to 150,000. But at each scale, we continued asking questions to test whether or not this was the right thing to do. Right? This is a good use of resources. Okay, and that's why I founded WireEyes in order to try to get people to think about that systematically, not just for a migration trial, but for everything that we do. So we kind of just like made I thought systematically about, okay, what are these complexities that arise as you start scaling things up that are not immediately obvious from your pilot scale trial, right? And try to create research networks and try to make some progress in these areas. That's what WireEyes do. Now, I think, and I had shared some readings along, I don't know if that got passed around, but this is one of the readings I shared. You don't have to read my, the econometric waiver I was talking about is like 80 pages printed. This one is just 2 or 3 pages, okay? So if you have only a few minutes, this is the one that will summarize a lot and summarize kind of my, this is in Nature, and I think it should be open access. Okay? All right. Now, okay, we're pretty much out of time. Let me just I'm going to skip over a lot of this and give you just one epilogue, right? And like one paper. This is a paper that's now coming out in quantitative economics. Okay? So essentially what happened was, look, we're working in North Bengal, right? Literally 10 kilometers away, 10 kilometers of India's chicken neck is the Nepali Terai. Okay? So we went to the Terai and I was like, okay, let's do this project here because agroecologically it's a very similar area. Okay? And so we piloted the same strategy, and I actually spent over a year piloting across the Terai, west and east. Okay? And ultimately we're working at the UP border, the Western Nepal. And we learned that our idea was completely irrelevant. Okay? Because already people were migrating, like 60 to 80% of people were already migrating. Right? So I don't need to encourage anybody to migrate. They will figure this out already. Why is that? Because unlike Bangladesh, the Nepal-India border is open, right? So a lot of Nepalis actually go to like Gujarat, to Kerala, Tamil Nadu, right? Where wages are much, much higher. Right? But they even go to Shimla for apple picking. So the wages, these are places that offer much higher wages. Wage gains are such that like it makes sense for people to already try to do this. Okay? But here's the surprising part. Even though our idea was irrelevant, there's still seasonal deprivation in the village. Remember that Bangladesh graph I showed you? Looks very similar there. Right? Pre-harvest lean season, a lot of people are reporting that they don't have they go hungry. Okay? So why is this happening? It turns out it's happening because while people are migrating, they don't remit money back during the lean season. Right? The money comes back. Here's a weird thing. The remittances are pro-cyclical. Like normally you want this to be counter-cyclical, right? Like when I don't have money, I need remittance. But when I have money at home, that's when I'm getting them. Because you're waiting for the migrant to come back. So in Bangladesh, what was going on is in my sample in Bangladesh, people were going back and forth. So I paid for the first trip. They would go for a few weeks, come back home, see their family, bring some money back, then go again, pay for it themselves, and then come back. Like that, like 3-month period was actually divided into multiple episodes. But if you're going all the way to Kerala, it's not easy to come back. So people don't. And so that's why we had a remittance problem. Okay. So there, we basically now try to figure out, okay, that big the early slide I had on various ways in which markets are failing to smooth consumption, I have to add a new thing, which is there's also a remittance friction. Right? So what's the remittance friction? It's that this is when I need money in the lean period at home. The migrant goes to the city, right? He has money here, but he's sitting on his money here. He can't send it back, right? So then I was like, okay, I need to redesign, rethink everything. So what I did was, I was like, look, this guy's gonna come back during harvest, right? He'll bring back the money. Okay. So why don't I give people, there's no remittance there. So why don't I give people a loan here and tell them you can pay me back 4 months later, right? And the way that works is that, look, he's going to bring the money. So I just need to connect this state to this state, right? Since these two states are already connected, if I just connect these two, then I give them an opportunity to move the money over here. Yeah. So we ran that experiment, like a loan that gets paid back with the remittance income. And we find that when you offer this loan, amount of remittance actually goes up because you are over consuming here, right? Because you can't, because there's no point in holding on to a lot of money. Right? So people actually save more here, they remit more, right? And they use the remittance to pay back the loan. Yeah. And then it gets even better, like people invest more in fertilizer and other agricultural investments here, they end up getting more harvest period in. Okay? So this actually worked as well. So basically the paper is about so what's the challenge, the paper with respect to referees, right? It's that I'm saying this loan program is actually addressing a remittance constraint, right? And of course, there's an assumption here, like maybe loans are valuable for other people. So that's the discussion I've had with referees. Okay, but I wanted to stop here. So we just covered about 8 papers, and we still have a few minutes to do some Q&A.
So, any question? Go forward. Now is the time to ask.
Yeah, I can talk to you about a 9th paper if you don't want to ask questions.
I can go ahead if anyone is asking. Thanks, Mushfiq, for this excellent presentation and kind of summarizing your work over the last 15 years and also kind of telling us about your philosophy of, why not to scale up when, there is all incentive to do that and think carefully about it. So, I would like to ask about, I don't know if you have been tracking these villages and migrants post-COVID and what do you observe in Bangladesh? Because, after COVID, I work in the Sundarbans region in India and kind of track some villages and households there. And before COVID, we used to see the pattern that the male members would migrate out. And during the COVID, there was lockdown and people came back. And after lockdown, what we are observing, and I don't have any hypothesis for this, is that not only are the males migrating out, but also their wives are migrating out with them and working in cities in other parts of India as household help or even working as agricultural laborers. So I don't know what you observed in Bangladesh and what are your things.
Okay, great. Okay, so actually, yeah, I was going to talk about during COVID, we did write some migration papers. So we have a paper in the if you get really interested, there's a paper in the European Economic Review. And Ashish Shenoy is one of my co-authors there. He's the ag department at UC. So you'll with this sample along with other international migrant sample, we talk about like how migrant families experienced the pandemic a little bit different, right? So that's my short answer. But actually, I want to talk about something totally different, which is that I'm now working in that, not as part of this project. I'm now working in that region, right? What Amita, of course, calls the tide country, but on the Bangladesh side, in Shatkhira, Bagirhat, Khulna, that's on our side. And the issue there is, like, the reason I bring this up is that maybe that's a COVID effect, but maybe it's a time series effect around climate change, right? So my projects there right now are about climate change. And what we've been observing there is that there's been increased salinity in the water, right, over time. So part of it is that I think creeping sea level rise, it's rising like 7-8 millimeters every year, right? So it's brackish water that's just getting more and more salty. And of course, that's bad for rice productivity. Yeah. So let me give you a sort of an alternative hypothesis as to why people might be migrating away more, right? So what has happened on the Bangladesh side, mass scale, like, what used to be green fields, now it's all water because people have moved heavily towards shrimp farming, right? There's a lot of aquaculture, and now even crab fattening. And I'll tell you a story that my son, like I now make him work as well. So he was talking to a shrimp farmer last summer. And the story is, so basically the issue with shrimp farming and aquaculture is that the minimum efficient scale of a gher shrimp pond is much larger than like the small plots of rice that we have in Bangladesh. Yeah. So you need much more space, right? But then what ends up happening is like this guy, the shrimp farmer he was talking to, he like leased in his neighbor's land, and he had like a 25-acre shrimp farm, right? And then my son tells me that, oh, he has one employee. Okay, like 25 acres, he has one employee because it's not very labor intensive, right? It's much more space intensive, right? You just need to like drain the pond and harvest, and you don't need that much labor, right? Now, actually, yeah, son was wrong in the sense that like I talked to him and he does use his dad and his brother helps him out, so it's not literally like, but still, like if that was 25 acres of rice farm, that would be employing a lot more people. Okay. So now what's going on is that because of the shift to shrimp farming, which might be good, right? It's a coping strategy, but like labor opportunities are disappearing for the landless workers, right? So I talked to some of them who were there, and they say bon kore mane. Do you speak Bangla? Anubhav?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
So that's what, yeah. So they say bon kore. Bon kore, mane, like they go to the Sundarban and they just like extract something. Like it could be honey, it could be like crabs to sell to the crab fattening people, right? And so some people are doing that, but of course, a lot of people I couldn't talk to are probably people who've disappeared because there's no work, right? Or there's less work now, and maybe they're in Dhaka, right? And I wasn't like talking to them there. So there's like other ecological changes that are happening. I think that's leading to other reasons for migration now. Right? But obviously, I mean, this is something that you might call climate migration, but again, like that's not the way, if I were to go and ask somebody in Dhaka, did you migrate because of climate change? Right? Obviously, that's not an answer they would give.
Right. Yeah. And migration is so endogenous, it's very hard to actually find out. No, that's absolutely right. So this is something which, we have been observing in the Indian Sundarbans over the last 7-8 years, but, the change particularly we saw after COVID, and that was very surprising, but maybe it's the effect of climate change as you spoke about it. So, a related question is that in the coastal parts of Bangladesh, do you see some improved soil salinity resistant varieties of rice being given, like something which is done in the Mekong Delta region, for example, in Vietnam?
Yeah.
So
yes,
does
so
that
there
deter
is
some of that
so
migration?
so both it's complicated. Okay, so I'll also talk to you about like an anthropologist's work on the Bangladesh side. So it is the case. Okay, there's two things happening. So I'm doing multiple projects in that area now. One of the projects I'm doing is actually like agricultural adaptation, and it's not just about new rice varieties. So the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute has developed some saline-resistant varieties, but it's also like shifting to a new crop. So it turns out sunflower does much better with saline situation compared to rice, right? So people are also shifting into trying new things, right? But you can imagine that this is all risky because, you want to also make sure that you can sell that crop, right? Or sell sunflower oil or whatever it is. Now, yeah, what else is something else that I was going to say is complicated. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. I'll give someone else the opportunity to ask questions. Thanks, Mushfiq. I'll connect with you and we can talk about
Sure. Oh, and where are you based?
At Virginia Tech. I did my PhD at UC Davis, so I know Ashish very well.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah.
I have a question. So when you did the loan program, so the loan had interest or it was just a...
I do zero interest loan.
So this model cannot be worked in reality. In a sense, some entrepreneur can start and say, I'll charge.
Yeah, so clearly, I mean, look, so think about the Nepal project, which I briefly mentioned, right? So there's still a seasonal deprivation problem. There's a failure in consumption smoothing, right? Then we said, oh, migration is a solution, but you also need to remit, right? Now, but that's not the only solution. Credit could be a solution too. It's just that like seasonal deprivation can only exist if all of these markets are failing in some ways, right? So it is the case that there are money lenders there, right? But the money lenders charge interest both in Bangladesh and Nepal. Like on an annualized basis, the interest rate is more than 100%.
Yeah.
More like 120, 140%, right? So there is credit, it's just very, very expensive, right? So of course, I'm coming in with 0% credit. There's probably some number in between. And I'm doing it with 0% because I'm, like all of the sort of IRB issues and everything associated with,
No, because I was thinking that if you start some interest rate, there will be a less propensity to take the deal, and there would be...
Sure, yeah. I mean, we can, like at some point, that's another scaling complexity, right? So one reason why we went with the grant program in Bangladesh on migration rather than like a loan program is that, these loans are very small, right? And it was going to cost me more than a taka to collect one taka. So there's no point.
No, yeah, you're right. These are experiments. I'm thinking from an entrepreneurial way out to this thing, so the governments can take something out of that and say, this is what we're going to do, rather than the NREGA program, which has been a disaster in India. What could be a way to salvage or end up with a new program that can easily be addressed, because the formal and informal lending, as we know in South Asia, is very different, so that was my thinking in a sense.
I think for some of the problems we've been discussing, like microfinance or with interest has a big role to play. It turns out like the big project I'm doing in the Sundarban region is giving people access to clean drinking water. Here we're setting up like reverse osmosis plants. And that's all like microfinance loans with the market interest, right? Yeah. And they play an extremely important role. Like for every $1 million I'm bringing into the project from outside, BRAC Microfinance is investing like $2.5 million, right? And but then there's other things like, when I'm making these loans for migration, which are like, we're talking about $20 loans. Yeah. I think we should be thinking about the scaling pathway there is really a government or philanthropic program, right? With the right type of design of the loan program where you're not forcing people to repay every 2 weeks, like the standard microfinancing.
Sure. Great. Thank you.
All right. So it's 3:20 already. We don't want to take a lot of Dr. Mobarak's time. So thank you so much, Dr. Mobarak, for your insightful and thought-provoking presentation. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. I hope you I hope you found this and informative as I did. And I do believe that discussions like these are very important for improving our understanding of this type of complex issues like poverty and migration. And by sharing knowledge only, we can work towards meaningful change. So if you have any further questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out or continue the conversation within our network. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Mobarak, for sharing your expertise, and to all of you for your participation. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.